Welcome everyone to today's session on gender and populism as part of this second season of the Populism seminar. Again, this is an initiative by Annika Werner, André Saslov, Lauritz Meyers, and myself. And today we are really excited to have two excellent scholars scrutinizing how gender and populism interrelate. So we have Hilde Coffe from the University of Bath and Cristian Norocel from Lund University. Before we start, let me give you just the house rules for today. As always, we're going to record this and you will find the video on YouTube and on our website in a couple of days. And there are two ways in which you can interact with our panel today. So you can either use the Q&A function to type your question, or you can use the raise your hand function, and we can then give you the permission to open your mic and you can pose your question right away. Without much further ado, let me hand over to Hilde for her starting statement.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to talk today about gender gaps among populist radical right voters and representatives. So when André contacted me, or when we were in touch, he asked me, as the main research question of today's roundtable, are populist radical right parties still male parties? I thought we could look at it from various ways, including to what extent women are overrepresented among voters, party members, members of parliament, or party leaders, and particularly with party leaders, as we see some leading radical right populist figures at the moment, including Marine Le Pen in France, but also Siv Jensen, Sylvie Listhaug in Norway, and Alice Weidel in Germany. So what I thought I would do is follow the question and answer it by looking and focusing, because that's also what I've been doing mostly in my research on the voters and the members of parliament, to see to what extent indeed women are still overrepresented among those groups. And to start the discussion and the roundtable, I will mostly focus on providing some data, which I think will and which I hope will offer food for further discussions. And the findings and ideas are based on papers and studies that I've been working on, often in collaboration with other people, including paper on with Tim Immerzeel and Tanja van der Lippe, and a project that I'm currently involved in with Anna Catalano-Weeks, Bonnie McGuire, and Mickey Carl-Kittleson, which is a paper below, which is currently under review, but which is also a larger project, as we are also continuing the work. Now, starting with the voters, this is the work from the project that I've been working on with Anna, Mickey, and Bonnie, and in which we look at gender differences defined as the male-female voter ratio in voting behavior for different party families across Europe, including Western and Eastern European countries from 1985 to 2018. And so the red line is the radical right populist party family, and you see that it has the highest score, meaning that indeed it's the party families where women are most likely to be underrepresented among the electorate. But we do see differences between the parties. So here you have an overview of some of the radical right populist parties, and you see that there are differences in the voting gap or in the gender gap among those different parties. And it's also in line with what I found in previous research with Tim Immerzeel and Tanja van der Lippe, where we showed that in some parties the gender gap is large, like in Norway, even though they do have female party leader, whereas it's low, for example, in Luxembourg, where there's almost no gender gap among the voters. So I think that's an interesting finding, where we see indeed women are still underrepresented, but you do see differences between the parties. Now, I've also moved beyond the gender gap because most studies on the gender gap in radical right voting more focus on the binary measure, even though we do often start from those masculine characteristics of radical right populist parties and leaders and how they may be at odds with feminine personality traits. So in this study, which focuses on Dutch data and in particular the likelihood of voting for the PVV, I tested the effect of feminine personality traits and masculine personality traits. Feminine personality traits did not have a significant effect, but masculine personality traits, as you can see in the figure, do. So the higher the masculine personality traits, the more likely that people are to vote for the radical right populist party. Now, even though masculine personality traits matter, controlling for it still remains, or even when controlling for it, the gender effect still remains, with women still being less likely to vote for the radical right populist party. So we do see that there is that effect of masculine personality traits moving beyond that binary gender measure. But we do see that also that gender gap then still remains. So those masculine traits like assertiveness, aggressiveness, do indeed seem to fit with the idea that we have about the masculine character of radical right populist parties, and which seem to be in line with the characteristics of those parties. Now, moving then to the women MPs and to women's representation in parliament from the different parties. And this is again taken from the study with Anna, Bonnie and Mickey. Here, the populist radical right party is given in the blue dotted line, and you see that there it tends to be low compared with the other party families, though we do see an increase in particular since the 2010s, which makes even at the end of the 2010s, so 2020, that we do see that women's representation is as high in the radical right populist parties compared with the Christian Democratic Party family. But indeed, going back to that main research question, are men overrepresented among women MPs? Well, men are overrepresented among all parties, but they are particularly overrepresented among the radical right populist party family. But here too, as with voters, we do see differences between the parties. And so this again gives an overview of the different party families between 1980, or the different radical right populist parties from 1980 to 2018. And we do see that, you know, there are differences between the different parties, with some having low proportion of women. For example, AfD tends to have a low number of women MPs. Even again, we do see female leadership within that party, whereas it's relatively high, for example, in France's Rassemblement National. Now, to answer that main research question then, yes, men are still overrepresented among voters and MPs, as are the masculine voters, that they are also overrepresented among radical right populist voters. Also, when compared with other parties, because as I said, when we are talking about MPs, of course, women are underrepresented among all parties, but it's particularly the case among populist radical right parties. But we do see some changes over time, differences between countries and differences between parties, which I think are interesting findings and definitely worth exploring. Now, I present just here briefly some explanations that have been given, first for women's underrepresentation among voters, where we've made the distinction between more demand-side explanations and supply-side explanations, concluding that even when taking those explanations into account, it still is a challenge to explain the gender gap, and that part of the puzzle really remains. And one example is that, especially in the beginning of the research, we thought, oh, maybe women will be more positive towards immigrant and as such less likely to vote for radical right populist parties. But in the meantime, research has shown that this is not the case, even though some research has suggested that whereas men and women do have similar attitudes. Women may find the issues addressed by radical right populist parties less salient. So maybe it's more about salience than about actual attitudes. Another is also women's greater focus on gender equality, but there too, there's a lot of diversity among radical right populist parties and their policy positions toward gender equality, with now parties, what has been called as a femo-nationalism, really focusing actually, or including at least some issues about gender equality, and contrasting that with the Islam, where there's no gender equality, etc. As supply side explanations, we've seen, for example, also an explanation of women's leadership, but there are too, as I gave some examples, like in the AfD in Germany, where we see few women MPs, but also other parties, like in Norway, led by women, where we've seen a large gender gap in voting behavior. Now, explanations for women's underrepresentation among SPs is so far less developed, and there's relatively little empirical research on the topic. As I said, with Anna, Bonnie and Mickey, we are studying the differences between populist radical right parties in the representation of women MPs. And we've developed what we call a theory of strategic descriptive representation. And with this theory, we suggest that given there is this large gap in gender gap in voting behavior, that is an attractive pool of voters, the women, that radical right populist parties have to gain if they want to increase their electorate success. And we argue that radical right populist parties do things strategically and are rational actors, and they will increase their number of women MPs when they hope to attract those previously untapped women voters to also vote for their party, because we know that voters support the parties partly, at least, based also on the basis of descriptive representation. So women will be more attracted to radical right populist parties if there's more women, and radical right parties will take that into account, especially when they are losing and when they know that there is a large gender gap in voting behavior among their electorates. And so it is what we found among the for our data on European parties. We see here, and here are the marginal effects of male and female voter ratio. And at the top left, you see that indeed, when the vote change is negative, so when a party is losing, the number of women MPs is going to increase, in particular when there is a large gender gap in the voting behavior. And we do have some numbers. So, for example, in substantive terms, when a radical right populist party has a men-dominated electorate, the predicted value of MPs is 14% of women if the party is gaining, but if it's losing, it's 20%. So we do indeed see the difference between parties, whether they are electorally losing or winning, in combination whether there is a significant gender gap in their voting behavior or not. So that's our idea of the strategic descriptive representation, for which we find support in Europe. So here you see the information at the left and the right about what is mostly described there in the figure. So when the populist radical right party is losing votes, a larger gender gap is correlated with more women MPs. Whereas at the other side, it's when the party when the radical right populist party is gaining votes, a larger gender gap is correlated with fewer women MPs. So to conclude, are populist radical right parties still main parties? Yes, women are still underrepresented among populist radical right voters and their representatives. And we also see one of the arguments presented now has been that populist radical right parties seem to be strategic actors who make a strategic calculation that increasing women may be electorally rewarding. And I think that's interesting also for further discussion about when would populist radical right parties have a larger or smaller number of women MPs. And then also the subsequent question, which we are also currently working on, what is the role of those women once elected, in particular then also on women's substantive representation. So whereas what I've shown was mostly about the descriptive representation, it will also be interesting to think some more about women's substantive representation within populist radical right parties, and also how that relates to the inclusion of women MPs and leaders. Thank you.
Excellent, Hilde. Thanks a lot for the presentation and for the insights you shared. May I hand over to Cristian right away, and then we open the floor for the debate.
Thank you so much. Let me see how things are working for us today. I hope that you can see the main page of my presentation. So first and foremost, I would like to thank so much the organizers for inviting me today to share a few insights into the aspect of gender and populism within this seminar. Please bear in mind that this is going to be a very selective and very schematic presentation. Yes, so within 15 minutes, it's hardly impossible to present everything that one would wish for. So for today, I plan to organize my presentation in what you see in here, like 4 steps. First and foremost, I would like to problematize the place of women. If indeed women have a place in radical right populism, or they are still maintaining their position in the resistance. Yeah, and then here I thought it was very nice to have this kind of presentation of it.
Cristian,
I argue.
I think you're not sharing the presentation part of the slide, so we are still stuck on the main page.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I will try to do it again, because in my case it was showing that I was.
Yeah, I could see it too. Yeah.
Would you? Yes. Now we're on the second page. Excellent.
Okay. So, as I was saying, my presentation is organized in 4 steps. The first one is problematizing the place of women. Do women have a place in radical right populism, or they are still maintaining their position in what we can call the resistance? I would also offer you a few glimpses in the ideological so-called counter-revolution of the radical right populism, in a sense complementing the presentation of my colleague. And I will try to illustrate these points by focusing on 2 specific cases, one from Northern Europe, the other one from Eastern Europe, and of course, if time allows, to draw some preliminary conclusions. So, as we can see, we already, as my colleague had already presented, we have several women that have high positions in radical right populist parties. Yes, so we have Marine Le Pen in Rassemblement National. We have as well Huhtasaari in the True Finns party that was actually one of the main counter candidates for the presidential elections just recently. But also in the Eastern European context, we have Dora, for instance, in here, that had left the radical right Jobbik party in favor of founding an even more radical party, because according to her own argument, the party was no longer radical enough for her liking. At the same time, we still have also in the Eastern European context, we see how a new series of newcomers, and in here we have one of the parliamentarians that are going to be discussing today from Romania, that had moved from a radical right populist party with a clear nationalist agenda into the fringe, into the further fringe of politics, becoming anti-vax and pushing this sort of disinformation campaign, at the same time with still having politicians that are striving to join the mainstream. Yes, and in here we have one of the longest leaders of any radical right populist party, yes, so Jimmy Åkesson, that now recently, yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, had been re-elected party chair for Sweden Democrats in Sweden. So to try to give you a very quick overview, I will not go through the wealth of literature that had discussed about the issue of gendering, if you wish, the ideological universe of radical right populist party. It's suffice to say that, yes, we start with the by now canonic remark of Mudde in early 2000s that these parties seem to be more or less mannerpartijen, yeah, so dominated by men. Since then, there has been a wealth of feminist and gender research that has shown that actually the ideological consistency of radical right populist party is actually incorporating a very strong gender perspective. And here we talk about, an anti-feminist, anti-LGBTQ plus rights and deeply conservative reasoning, added to their xenophobic and at times openly racist, Islamophobic and anti-democratic appeals. And then here I'm going to be looking at two key concepts that I find useful for the presentation today. And one of them is that of politics of fear, developed by Ruth Wodak in 2015, and the one that is called care racism, developed by colleagues in Sweden. And at the same time, I would like to draw your attention to the very specific socio-political context that I'm focusing my talk on today, i.e. Northern Europe, in which we have previously a so-called woman-friendly welfare states that at the moment are under pressure, that witness the radical right populism march into mainstream politics, and little by little, even their incorporation in various governmental constellation, like we have already seen in the Finnish case in which they were part of government. We saw also in the Norwegian case in which they were also part of government, or in the Danish case in which they supported the government, as well as something incipiently happening in the Swedish case that I will detail in a little bit in my presentation. At the same time, we have Eastern Europe, which seems to be ravaged by neoliberal dogma, but also it's embracing conservatism and a series of radical right populist iterations. Yeah, so these can happen either by the radicalization of previously a mainstream party. And here I'm thinking of the, by now, a classical example, if you wish, of Fidesz in Hungary, that by some of our colleagues would argue that it is a radical right populist party, but also in the Romanian context, what my colleagues have named a phoenix populism. Yes, so a radical right populism that appears constantly on the political scene in various political vehicles. And one of these I will be addressing in a little bit. And in here, just for the illustration, you can see, for instance, when we look at the Swedish case, how the party had continuously increased its political support. And we see that in the latest elections, they had become the third largest party. And I focus on the ideological context, so how the party had tried to, as I call in here, mimic gender equality as a tool for achieving a mainstream status and make palatable their ideology to a wider swathe of political supporters. And in here, I argue that what has happened in the Swedish context is very interesting, because the party is acknowledging the fact that they need more women supporters in order to achieve a wider appeal among the populace and also improve their electoral score. At the same time, they still have problems with adapting their discourses. So if by now the classical politics of fear that they were always used to mobilize against, particularly the Muslim migrant other. And here I have chosen two different quotations from Jimmy Åkesson, as I said, that has already been confirmed today, the party leader. Åkesson has been the party chair of Sweden Democrats since 2010. So since 2005, sorry. So he has a very long history of continuously trying to repackage the ideological content of the party in such a manner that would be becoming more acceptable and more palatable for the electorate. And it was interesting while analyzing his political activity to notice how little by little during these years he had tried to widen the appeal. So not only using politics of fear, but also trying to direct, particularly towards women, and articulating the so-called politics of care racism. Yeah, so appealing directly to women and articulating a female figure at what it's called a Swedish, a friend of Sweden at heart, in which a woman that is described as having Swedish-friendly values and mores, one that is supporting her family, that is defending tradition, and that is seeking to provide a feeling of security in the community. So if you compare the two quotes in here, that's a very strict distinction between how these women supporters are described, at the same time with the present society as is described by the Sweden Democrats as one in which we see that foreign rapists are endangering the Swedish women, in which we see that the head covering is forced onto young women and preschool children across the country, in which we see that thousands of girls are locked into honor structures and Islamism. So it's interesting how in here the position of women, the native women, and the other women, if you wish, the women of a migrant background are described, and also what sort of agency it's allowed to them. So one as potential voters, the other ones are just passive victims of the oppression of the migrant other. At the same time, what is I found extremely interesting in the context of the pandemic, we are still, it seems, in this thing, the party does not necessarily seem to be very much interested in pushing or preserving the woman-friendly welfare state as we see at the moment in Sweden, at the same time in which they say, well, we do not need all this common ethical foundation, we do not need gender theories, we just need to have a welfare state that works, and in which we need to focus on the bigger picture and not on the small change. And I would argue that in this context is basically trying to shift the focus from the previously outright politics of fear to more of a care racism adapted to the pandemic situation. And we could see in here even how this efforts have determined a particular shift among the other conservative parties in Swedish politics. And we can see how it's becoming more and more mainstream. And recently the center-right conservatives and the Christian democratic conservatives have announced that they are prepared to start thinking of this triad as a potential basis for a governmental formula. Of course, there is still some reticence in terms of if the party would be part of the government or not, but they are still, we see in here as I note down, the party opposing such coalition have been already describing them as a blue-brown alliance, yeah, referring to Sweden Democrats' neo-Nazi and extremist roots. If very quickly, to try to zoom out from the region and zoom in Eastern Europe, we see in here what I was arguing for, the various repackagings of radical right populism. So at least in the Romanian context, we see that now, if you count, we are at least at the third iteration of radical right populism. So we have previously the Greater Romania Party in the early 2000s. Then we have the People's Party, Dan Diaconescu, that was a one-person's party in the early 2010s, and now we have the Alliance for the Unification of Romania, unity of Romanians that had been just recently founded and has already successfully contested the latest elections. It's interesting because in here, as I put on the slide, the party has been founded by main figures from a coalition that was previously called the Coalition for Family, that had as its purpose to organize a referendum against equal marriage rights. They managed to push that the referendum was organized, but it failed, and it failed. The coalition was accusing actually the other political actors for lack of mobilization, and then suddenly we see how this coalition turns into an electoral vehicle, and it founds this Alliance for the Unity of Romanians. And as I said, the party is now the fourth largest political force in the Romanian parliament, and they have also tried to contest the elections in Moldova, but they failed. Among this party, I would like to focus on one specific politician, Diana Yovanovic. And she has a very interesting political trajectory. She has appeared just as quickly in the political mainstream as the party itself. And of course, in here we see the more consecrated tropes of radical right populism in terms of, an overemphasis on national belonging. And in here, for instance, we see how she's, in one of the interviews, she's defining herself as a real fighter against the illegalities. She loves Romania and Romanians. She is proud of being a Romanian, and she fights for restoring the dignity as well as raising awareness about Romanian values. Yes, even though her background is actually half Macedonian, if you wish to think in these terms, and also specific to the Eastern European context, this emphasis on the anti-communist pedigree and the fact that she had been tempted of remaining in the global north, in Canada, for example, in this case, but she has chosen to return to Romania because she was longing home. So in a way to kind of to build a persona around the fact that she is responsible for political fate of Romanians and that she's taking that responsibility very seriously. In the context of the pandemic, however, it seems that she's taken a very extreme route, and in the end, she has actually been expelled from the party around the anti-vax mobilization. And in here, we see how, again, it's a reference to women, but in here we have a clear use of the politics of fear, in which is arguing that women are killed by taking the vaccination. Actually, women become sterile, and the vaccination is in fact, if you wish, a conspiracy to kill the whole Romania as a nation. Interestingly enough, in this context, is that she doesn't miss the opportunity of greeting the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, from the Fidesz party that I was naming earlier, and remarking that perhaps at some point Romania will also have a nationalist government just like Hungary. To sum up, because the time has run out, as you could notice from my alarm, I would argue that the two cases illustrate our preoccupation with women, and particularly their bodies, in radical right populism. Both men, such as Imi Okeson, but also women, as Diana Shashaka, are vectors of such politics which provide insights into the gender dimension of their ideological universe. And then here we see how demographic anxieties, so this idea that there are not enough Swedish or Romanian women, or they are not marrying the right kind in their view, determine an appeal to the ethnic and racial majority to join the so-called radical right populist counter-revolution. And here we have to keep in mind also how the pandemic context had played and shaped their policies. But to conclude, I would say that gender is very important for this type of politics, but the manner and the place that is afforded to women to actively participate in this kind of counter-revolution effort and shaping these policies is constrained actually by very traditional ideas and gender hierarchies specific to each European society. With this said, I will stop here.
Excellent. Many thanks for the interesting presentation and the insights that you shared from your work. So let's open the floor, and please use the Q&A function or the raise your hand function to indicate that you would like to ask a question, and then we can pose the question to the panelists.
If there's no questions, I could start with a question.
Yep.
I have to apologize to the panelists. I have to leave in about 5 minutes. I have to teach. So it's not that I didn't like your presentations. I like them very much. But I'll start with a question for Hilde. So I liked your presentation. and you kind of touched on it with one of your slides, but I was wondering if you maybe wanted to elaborate more on it. So do you see any, I was wondering, do you see any patterns, I would say in three ways, between different four types of parties? So when I was just looking at your slides very quickly, I would almost, in my head, I was already making distinctions between populist parties that were maybe more or less populist or extreme or not. So that was one thing. And then I was wondering as well, maybe differences between regions. Do you sort of, just kind of, I mean, you know, just sort of thinking just out of the top of your head. And then I was also wondering, and you kind of answered it at the end, a little bit with in and out of government, or, you know, of electoral success and not. So, but I was wondering, do you see any differences over time? Because I mean, so you mentioned Le Pen, and I was just sort of wondering about the question of mainstreaming in terms of these issues. I'll leave it there. I have a question for Cristian, but I think I'll just ask this right now and see. Yeah.
Thank you, Andre, for those questions and thought. I think I like your idea about looking at the differences between the different parties and how how we can see different patterns between the for what we find. As I said, there's party with women leaders where we see a large gender gap, where we see high or low women's representation. So it goes in all, or at least that characteristic seems to go in all direction. We did explore some differences between Western and Eastern Europe, but from memory, they were not huge, so the patterns seem to be the same in both regions. But I think it's interesting to explore what you say about those the different characteristics of the within the party family and how they may relate to gender gaps. We did look at in the research with Tim and Tanya van der Lippe. We did look at different party characteristics, but we couldn't find much there, at least not for the gender gap in voting behavior. So I think it is something where more work can definitely be done, really those differences within the radical right populists, because we know the general patterns, but I think more can be done on the differences within the larger party families. And as you say, we can look them from different perspectives, women's leaders, how long they exist, because sometimes, they get more moderate than as long as they exist. I mean, there's many, angles to look at it. And it's a bit in line with, what you said about over the mainstreaming, how that also relates. Do we see changes over time as the longer party exists? Maybe they may want to become less extreme, maybe more keen to become part of a government, etc. And in that sense, gender gaps may decline, but we didn't find such pattern in the paper with Tim, which was Populism Comparative Politics. So we didn't find any effect there of the longer the parties exist, that the gender gap in voting would be smaller. But good points, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we have two questions from the audience. I will allow the first one to open the mic, so you should now be able to speak.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool, thank you very much for these very nice presentations. I actually have a question, one for Hilde and the other one for Cristian, so I will just pose both of them. And so with regards to your presentation, Hilde, I find this idea of the theory of strategic distributed representation very interesting. I was wondering how, or if you have thought about, in a way, checking and controlling for the effect of institutional policies with regards to gender equality and women representation. Many of the countries that you have exploring implemented compulsory quotas and electoral quotas. So I was wondering how these type of measures could actually impact in the type of results that you have, in the sense that, of course, parties are in a way forced to candidate very often 50-50 or 60-40% ratios of women and men candidates. So how, in a way, this type of institutional like policies, like and interventions, in a way, can actually affect the type of results that you have. So if you have any thoughts on that, I will be happy to hear that. For what concerned Cristian presentation, thank you very much. Super interesting. I do agree. I think with the like bottom line kind of like takeaway of your presentation, the fact that basically, of course, like the claim for like joining the counter revolutions on the side of like populist radical right parties, or in a way also fringe forces, still like push forward like an idea of like women that is very much contained into traditional gender roles and so on. I was wondering how this type of results can also be like connected to instead like the type of like, in a way, process of empowerment, which I see like some results, like ethnographic research especially, have shown of women that are actually participating in, so like that are activists in this movement. So what we can draw from that, if you have any thought of this, would be very nice to hear that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Hilde, do you want to start?
After a year and a half, still need to learn how to unmute myself. But thank you for your questions, Francesca. I think that's a very relevant issue, as we do control for various measures, including whether there's a quota law, also whether it's proportional representation, also in general women in parliament. And we do find support for the claim that parties have higher levels of women representatives when there is a national norm for having a larger proportion of women. We also find that legislated gender quotas, they are marginally significant, also in the expected direction. We do not find that the measures of institutional permissiveness, like district magnitude and proportional representation, have a significant effect on women MPs in radical right populist parties, and nor do women leaders increase women in radical right populist parties. So our findings are controlled for these characteristics, and we do see also that some of them indeed do matter for women's representation among those parties. Thank you.
Thank you for the response. Cristian, may I hand over to you?
Grazie, Francesca. Indeed, it's a very interesting question. And I would argue, I mean, in the research that I have done so far, on the one hand, if we are to corroborate Hilde's findings, yes, with how these parties growingly try to appeal to a wider electorate, and particularly to women, we see how some women have access to positions of power, either as chairs or even, you know, within the high party politics. What happens is that it's extremely individualized. So the opportunities for those women are very singular, in the sense that the ideological universe, it maintains its traditional aspect. So I would argue, and this was in a way, I cannot say that I need to read that research that you made reference to, but from, for instance, what has happened just recently in Sweden, it was that the gender equality representative, the Sweden Democrats MP for the gender equality representative within the party, she had recently announced that she's stepping down. She's now going to participate in the coming elections, naming the fact that all her pushes have been frustrated by an unwilling party to address the gender equality agenda. And in a way, I agree with her, because when I was looking very quickly through how the party actually tries to address this issue in the Swedish context, in which almost every single party needs to pronounce itself, its support for gender equality, at least formally. It was very interesting, because the party program, for instance, named gender equality by its name a handful of times, whilst the focus was rather on family. So family as nuclear family, heterosexual family, family with children, women as mothers in the family was given a much bigger role. So there we talk like, you know, something like 10, 15 references to families. Well, you know, the issue of gender equality, as I said, it was just a handful of times. And that was just the very superficial thing that I've done, you know, looking at their party agenda. So I would argue that ideologically, the parties still are very traditional. They still expect women to fall back into this kind of patriarchal expectations. However, those patriarchal expectations are profiled towards the ethnic majority. So then their patriarchal expectations would be, if you wish, better than, for instance, the patriarchal expectations of the migrant community. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. There is another question from the audience. I will open the mic for Luca.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I have two questions. The first goes to you, Hilde. Thanks for the fantastic overview. I wondering what, and you touched upon that at the end, what you think about the effect of women once they are in power in these radical right parties. How do they communicate their gender ideology, and how is it consistent with the parties? So can you see any patterns of how women generally deviate perhaps from the party line or ideology related to gender issues? And the second question, Cristian, goes to you. You discussed the Swedish case, and I found that very interesting because, I mean, as you know, Sweden is very progressive in terms of gender issues, and I was wondering what's going to happen now for the next election, because I've heard that the cordon sanitaire is somewhat broken now between the Sweden Democrats and the more right-leaning parties, the Liberals, Centerpartiet, and so on. So how will they collaborate on gender issues, and how do they communicate that this gap between progressiveness and the conservative positions of SD? Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Luca, for these questions. Shall we go in the order of the questions again? So Hilde, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you, Luca, for these questions. So as I said, it's a paper that we are currently working on, so it's still preliminary, but what our findings, so we use data from the Comparative Manifesto database project, and also some originally data coded for radical right populist parties' attention to women's interests over time. So mostly the extent to which they focus on it, not as much yet the topics themselves. But what we do find is that women MPs and party leaders do not seem to alter the radical right populist party's emphasis on women's issues. So it's not that when there's more women or when there's a woman leader that radical right populist parties pay greater attention or more attention to women's interests. Rather, it seems more that radical right populist parties increase their attention to at least certain women's issues only, again, when they are losing electorally. So that it's really, again, that strategic thinking and radical right populist parties being rational actors and changing their focus when when they are losing electorally. And the next step will then be also the content of the issues. So as I said, so far it's mostly on the extent to which women's issues are focused, and the next step will then also be the content of those women's interests, whether they are supportive of gender equality or not, because we know that there is diversity among radical right populist parties, for example, on the issue of gender equality. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks. Cristian, may I hand over to you?
Yes, bedankt, Luca, for your question. I mean, if we are to be, we do not do that as political scientists. Yes, so we do not have a crystal ball. We cannot really see in the future. But what we can see from what is already has happened on the ground is there is a move, particularly from the conservatives, Moderaterna, but also from the Christian Democrats, towards a normalization of the Sweden Democrats. Yes, I would argue that in the Swedish case, we can no longer talk about the cordon sanitaire. We see how actually we entering the later stages of mainstreaming of the radical right. It's going to be very interesting to see how the discussion for the coming government coalition would look like if indeed these parties will preserve their electoral support in the coming elections. We haven't seen that yet, so I cannot pronounce myself on doing that. However, since I am also part of another research project that deals with issues of anti-gender campaigns in Northern Europe, I could, however, notice that, for instance, there is a higher degree of convergence, if you wish, on terms of ideological convergence, in terms of attitude towards gender equality, gender studies, and a progressive agenda in general. So from the preliminary data that I have collected on the webpage of Riksdagen, so their motions and their interpolations, it seems that criticism towards, for instance, the Gender Equality Agency, criticism towards gender studies scholars, criticism towards a progressive agenda in terms of women's rights is not only if you wish, the area in which the Sweden Democrats parliamentarians are active, but actually it starts being appropriated, if you wish, by both representatives from the Moderaterna, but also from Kristdemokraterna. So we see how these parties are little by little finding themselves one another in terms of conservative approaches to women's rights. So I would agree in here with the research that was done on the Eastern European context in terms of, like, gender becoming the symbolic glue that allows conservative actors, regardless if they are conservative right, mainstream right, Christian Democrats, and radical right populists, to find one another and identify a new area of collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristian, for the response to this question. So there's one more question in the Q&A, but let me remind all those in the audience who would like to pose a question that you can raise your hand or type a question in the Q&A. So there's one question by the co-host Annika Werner, actually, thanking you both for your interesting presentations. And she's interested in the relationship between feminism and the radical right populist parties. And so there's one question for Hilde. Do you think that those women who vote for those parties, these PRP parties, do they do this because of the gender roles that these parties put forward, or despite of those gender roles and perspectives they hold? And for Cristian, there is a question, do you think that feminist women could be leaders of these parties, or is it a structural necessity for female leaders to be anti-feminist? Do you want to go first, Hilde?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. I think it's a shame that Andre had to leave, because he has done some research on radical right voters and their attitudes towards gender equality and feminism. What I can say is that there is more diversity also among radical right populist parties themselves towards gender equality and feminism. And there is differences between those parties across Europe. And I briefly mentioned it in my presentation. So there is this issue of what is referred to now as femo-nationalism, with especially Nordic countries, and Cristian might also know more about it, with this focus more on the Nordic countries, where we see that combination of gender equality and supporting gender equality, and contrasting it with what we see, or at least what they argue in the Islam, that they are not supportive of gender equality. And look, if they get more, if we get more Islam and more Muslim people, we might lose our culture of gender equality, etc. So to answer your question, I think it's also important to keep in mind that the link may not be as straightforward, because there is the diversity among radical right populist parties themselves. And we also see it in the Netherlands, where that has also been a focus, for example, within the PVV, how we see there, that femo-nationalism occurring. So I think while previously say in the 1980s, we indeed thought that, radical right populist parties are again gender equality, and women will not support these parties because they don't support gender equality, etc. I do think that the relationship might have changed now, without saying, that we may still see more conservative women voting for these parties, but that it is important to keep the diversity among the radical right populist parties in mind.
Thank you. Cristian?
Yes, thank you so much, Annika, for your question. In a way, I will be echoing and perhaps trying to nuance Hilde's answer. To date, I would argue that the possibility for outspoken feminist woman leader of a radical right party is it's very low. And I say this because even in those cases in which you would see women politicians taking leadership roles within these parties, they have been extremely careful of carving out a role that navigates away from a feminist agenda. So even though there are women politicians in politics, they will always be very carefully emphasizing the fact that, yes, I am a woman in politics, but I am not a feminist. And even in a country such as Sweden, in which, as I said, gender equality is very high up on the agenda, the Sweden Democrats have been navigating a very, very delicate way between trying to attract women voters and at the same time, steering very clearly away from feminism. So from that point of view, I would agree with Hilde that maybe femonationalism is a trope within this ideological universe. It's used to attract voters. However, this is more of an instrumental resort rather than a fully acknowledged, fully committed feminist agenda. I was thinking that basically, even in the cases in Eastern Europe that I have studied, the women politicians, and it's also very interesting that there have been many more women politicians of the radical right in Eastern Europe than in Sweden, which might be telling us something about the political background of the political culture of this country. Those women have been painfully careful saying that I am not a feminist. I am representing a specific traditional conservative pool of values. I'm in favor of traditional family and so on and so forth. And always trying to navigate on the one hand between that sort of conservatism and that sort of traditionalism, opposing their conservatism and traditional values to the alleged even more conservative and even more patriarchal vision of the migrant daughter. At the same time, also when taking, as I said, a clear distance between what does it mean to have an emancipatory agenda, what does it mean to have a feminist agenda? Yeah? So they are kind of caught in between these two positions.
Excellent, thanks for the response. So there are no further questions from the audience. Let me pose one last question myself to both of you. One thing that I've noticed throughout both of your presentations is that thick ideology and thin ideology combined play an important role. But a lot of the arguments you make are about thick ideology in terms of radical right-wing populist parties being far right to one extent or the other. So I've been wondering a bit, what's the element of populism here? And does it even matter? And if no, then fair enough. What are your thoughts on that? So what are your insights, for example, from more left-wing or valence populist parties somewhere in the middle of the political spectrum? Does populism play a role here, or is it really mostly the thick ideology of those parties that drives their stances? Who wants to go first?
Cristian may go first this time. But happy to start if you prefer. It was a joke.
As you wish.
You may start then.
Okay. Well, it's one of those moments in which I have to kind of, if you wish, come out as a purist. Yeah. And I would say that my understanding of radical right populism is very much anchored into that ideological understanding of the concept. So for me, I would have rather, it would take quite a bit of discussion to be convinced that we can talk about a left-wing populism. Perhaps we can talk about an agonistic politics, we can talk about other things. However, I would not describe it as populist. What I see, the presence of populism in this radical right populist ideological universe is always this discussion between, even when these parties have been in a position of power. Yes, so we talk about parties that have been in national parliaments, in the European Parliament for quite some time. They are established, they get a lot of funding, they have their own foundations, their own infrastructure. They still like to present themselves as the ones who dare to speak the truth against the power, the ones who dare to speak against the elites. And I'm always like, wait a bit, people, which elites do you talk about? You are very much also part of the elite. So I would argue that in this context, what we see is, and in here I use a specific context from gender studies. Yes, I'm talking about superordinate intersectionality, because I can look at competing elites that are trying to have their own view onto how politics should be driven. Whitenesses in terms of, both the majority is white, but we have a certain understanding of a more liberal understanding of the society or a more restrictive understanding of the society. So I wouldn't say that we have that sort of clash of the clash of Promethean clash, yeah, between a higher oppressive disconnected elite and the voice of the people. No, they are very much on the same elitistic position. It's just that they present themselves as being the true voice, the only representatives, the quiet, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so I'm very skeptical about that aspect, but it is used. So the populist trope, it is very much used for political gain in that context. Hilde?
Yes, thank you. So to answer it from a more maybe empirical perspective, we did look at using expert survey data. We asked experts to what extent they thought the different parties were populist. And we did find that it did not explain the gender gaps in Europe. So that's what we found in the paper in comparative politics with Tim and Tanya. So that the populist aspects, at least how it was measured using the expert survey data, that it could not explain the gender difference. So I guess that means that at least based on those findings, that the populist character plays little role for women and men voters and for explaining the difference between both. But I think it's an interesting point to make that difference between, is it the populist aspect? Is it the radical aspect? Because for the radical aspect, they also say that women will be less likely to, to vote for extremes and that they will prefer mainstream, so that you could obviously find at both sides. But then it would be interesting indeed to make that difference between the populist and the extreme or the radical aspect.
Thank you for those responses. I think they are quite important for us to be analytically clear in terms of what are we talking about, what are we thinking about, right? And I think this is part of the debate that we would like to have in the Populism Seminar. So let me close the session and give the audience a bit more information on the next sessions. So first of all, let me thank you, Hilde, let me thank you, Cristian, for this excellent presentations and the discussion and the way you handled the questions. I think this was fascinating and absolutely insightful for the audience and for us, the organizers as well. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us. So we have a couple of upcoming sessions, and let me just highlight the next two sessions that we have. So in 2 weeks' time, we have a session on the new perspectives on populist success. So that's the 13th of December, same time as usual, with Noam Guidron and Elena Barro providing new insights, methodological insights into why populists are successful or not. Then we have a short Christmas break, but we are back in the middle of January, where Laura Jacobs and Nico Matasunaga present interesting research on the mainstreaming of populism and how populist ideas may also enter the political mainstream to a larger extent. So let me close the session here. Thank you all for your participation, the fantastic questions and your fantastic responses. And I hope to see you soon in one of the next iterations of the Populism seminar. Have a lovely day and great start of the week ahead.